Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Korean Peninsula. How can two nations occupying the same small landmass, sharing a common language, a deeply intertwined heritage stretching back thousands of years, have diverged so utterly and completely in less than a century? On one side of the 38th parallel you have South Korea, a vibrant, hyper-connected democracy, a global leader in technology, culture and economic development, home to bustling cities like Seoul, where neon lights illuminate towering skyscrapers and K-pop anthems blast from every corner. It's a country that went from utter devastation in the 1950s to becoming the 10th largest economy in the world, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. Then, just 60 miles north, lies North Korea, one of the most isolated, authoritarian and opaque states on Earth, a country where information is tightly controlled, where the internet as we know it doesn't exist, where a cult of personality surrounds a single family, and where the outside world is viewed with deep suspicion. Satellite images at night famously show South Korea ablaze with light, while its northern neighbour remains largely a vast, dark expanse. This isn't just a difference in political systems, it's a difference in realities so profound they almost defy comprehension, like two different planets orbiting the same sun. How did this happen? What forces, what historical currents, what decisions, both grand and minute, led to such a stark, almost unbelievable bifurcation of a single people? It's a question that unlocks not just the history of a peninsula, but the very nature of ideology, power, and human possibility. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. What is Korea, fundamentally? Before it was two, it was one. For millennia, the Korean Peninsula existed as a distinct cultural and political entity, often caught between powerful neighbours, but always maintaining its unique identity. Think about its geography for a second. A mountainous peninsula roughly 600 miles long and 170 miles wide at its narrowest point, jutting out from the Asian mainland, a natural bridge between China and Japan. This physical position has been both a blessing and a curse, shaping its history as a conduit for culture and a battleground for empires. The story of a unified Korea begins not with division, but with deep roots in antiquity. The earliest recorded kingdom, Joseon, emerged in the northern part of the peninsula and Manchuria, supposedly founded in 2333 BCE by Dangun, a mythical figure born from a bear and a god. While the Dangun myth is, well, a myth, archaeological evidence confirms complex societies were indeed forming in the region by the first millennium BCE. Joseon, a Bronze Age civilization, certainly existed and interacted with early Chinese states, primarily through trade and inevitably conflict. By 108 BCE, the Han dynasty of China conquered Joseon, establishing several commanderies. This marked a crucial early period of Chinese influence, but it also spurred the development of new independent Korean states in the south. This brings us to one of the most fascinating periods in early Korean history, the Three Kingdoms. From around 57 BCE to 668 CE, The peninsula was dominated by three rival kingdoms: Goryeo in the north, 668 CE Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast. These weren't just tribal confederations, they were sophisticated states with established monarchies, legal codes, and armies. Goryeo, often seen as the most powerful and martial of the three, controlled a vast territory that extended into Manchuria, frequently clashing with Chinese dynasties and demonstrating formidable military prowess. Its capital, Pyongyang, the same city that is North Korea's capital today, was a thriving centre of power. Baekje, adept at maritime trade, cultivated strong ties with Japan, transmitting continental culture and technology across the sea. Silla, initially the weakest, focused inward, developing a unique bone-rank aristocratic system that dictated social status and power. This era was a crucible for Korean identity. All three kingdoms adopted Buddhism from China, which profoundly shaped their art, architecture, and philosophy. They absorbed Confucian ideas about governance and social order, and their scholars developed writing systems based on Chinese characters. Yet they didn't simply become extensions of China. They adapted these influences, creating distinct Korean styles in everything from their intricate golden crowns, unearthed from Silla tombs, to the imposing fortresses of Goryeo. The competition between these kingdoms was fierce, marked by shifting alliances, betrayals, and epic battles. But it was Silla, leveraging an alliance with Tang China, that eventually conquered Baekje in 660 CE and Goryeo in 668 CE, unifying much of the peninsula under a single rule. This Quote 1 period, lasting until 935 CE, truly laid the groundwork for a singular Korean identity, establishing a centralized bureaucracy and a flourishing Buddhist culture, epitomized by magnificent temples like Bulguksa and the Seokguram Grotto. Following the unified Silla period, the Goryeo dynasty rose to power in 918 CE, establishing a new capital at Kaesong. It's from this dynasty that the modern name Korea is derived. Goryeo was a period of immense cultural achievement, particularly renowned for its exquisite Celadon pottery, a ceramic art form that reached unparalleled levels of sophistication and beauty. With its distinctive jade-green glaze and intricate inlaid designs, Buddhism continued to be the state religion, and the kingdom developed a robust civil service examination system, similar to China's, to select officials. But Goryeo was also a dynasty that faced relentless external pressure. From the 10th to the 12th centuries, it endured repeated invasions from the Khitan and Jurchen tribes to its north. Then came the Mongols in the 13th century. Think about this for a second. The Mongol Empire at its peak was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Their invasions of Korea beginning in 1231 were brutal and devastating. For nearly 3 decades, the Goryeo court resisted, even fleeing to Ganghwa Island off the west coast. During this time of immense national crisis, a truly remarkable project was undertaken: the carving of the Tripitaka Koreana, an entire Buddhist canon etched onto more than 80,000 wooden printing blocks. This wasn't just a religious act. It was a desperate plea for divine protection, a monumental cultural undertaking that stands today as one of the most complete and oldest Buddhist canons in the world. It's a testament to the Korean people's enduring faith and their commitment to preserving their heritage, even in the face of existential threat. Ultimately, Goryeo succumbed to Mongol dominance, becoming a tributary state, but crucially it maintained its sovereignty and distinct cultural identity, avoiding direct annexation. The Goryeo dynasty eventually fell in 1392, not to external forces, but to an internal military coup led by General Yi Seong-gye. This ushered in the Joseon dynasty, which would rule Korea for over 500 years, making it one of the longest-lived dynasties in East Asian history. Joseon fundamentally shifted the philosophical landscape of Korea, largely replacing Buddhism with Neo-Confucianism as the guiding state ideology. This meant a renewed emphasis on hierarchical social order, filial piety, education, and loyalty to the state. The Yangban, a scholar gentry class, became the dominant social and political force. This is where it gets genuinely interesting for Korea's long-term trajectory. It was during the Joseon era, specifically in the 15th century under the brilliant King Sejong the Great, that one of Korea's most profound and defining innovations emerged: Hangul, the Korean alphabet. Before Hangul, Koreans used Chinese characters, which were incredibly complex and difficult for the common person to learn. King Sejong, recognizing this barrier to literacy, commissioned scholars to create a new phonetic alphabet that was remarkably simple and scientific. It literally takes just a few hours to learn the basic characters. This wasn't just a linguistic reform, it was a revolutionary act that democratized knowledge and solidified a distinct Korean cultural identity, separate from China's. However, the late Joseon period also saw Korea increasingly adopt a policy of isolationism, earning it the moniker, quote, Three. This wasn't entirely by choice. The Imjin War, a series of devastating Japanese invasions from 1592 to 1598, ravaged the peninsula. Led by the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, these invasions were brutal, causing immense destruction and loss of life. Korea survived largely due to the brilliant naval strategies of Admiral Yi Sun-sin and his innovative turtle ships, armoured warships covered with spikes to deter boarding, often considered the world's first ironclads. But the war left Korea exhausted and wary of foreign contact. Further invasions by the Manchu in the early 17th century solidified Korea's position as a tributary state to the Qing dynasty of China and reinforced its policy of self-imposed isolation. This long period of relative peace, but also of cultural and economic stagnation, would leave Korea vulnerable when the great imperial powers of the 19th century came knocking on its doors, and we're only getting started. This long, rich history of a unified, distinct Korean identity, shaped by geography, culture, and foreign pressures, would soon collide with the forces of global imperialism, setting the stage for the unimaginable divisions that would unfold in the 20th century. But that's a story for the next chapter. The Joseon dynasty, having weathered centuries of invasion and internal strife, finally retreated into itself, earning the moniker Hermit Kingdom. It was a desperate, almost tragic attempt to preserve its unique identity and Confucian values from a rapidly changing world. But history, as we know, rarely respects isolation. The 19th century was a crucible of global change, and Korea, nestled precariously between ambitious empires, was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming into the modern age. Imagine this. For centuries, Korea had successfully navigated its position, maintaining its cultural distinctiveness even while acknowledging the suzerainty of China. But as the sun began to set on the Qing dynasty, a new, far more aggressive dawn was breaking for a different neighbour, Japan. Meanwhile, Western powers, fueled by industrial might and imperial ambition, were knocking on every closed door in Asia. The stage was set for a dramatic, painful re-entry into the world. In the mid-1800s, French and American gunboats, symbols of an unstoppable technological tide, began appearing off Korea's coast, demanding trade and diplomatic relations. These were not the familiar land-based invasions of old. These were challenges to Korea's very worldview, its chosen path of self-sufficiency. The initial response was defiant rejection, a fierce defense of the closed-door policy. But the technological gap was too vast. The Korean military, still largely relying on antiquated weaponry, was no match for modern artillery. This external pressure, however, wasn't the only force at play. Internally, Joseon was grappling with its own crises. Corruption was rampant, social stratification was rigid, and the peasantry suffered under heavy taxes and famine. It was a powder keg, and the spark came in the form of the Donghak Peasant Revolution in 1894. This wasn't just a localized uprising, it was a massive, widespread movement driven by a unique blend of indigenous Korean religious beliefs, Donghak, or Eastern learning, and a powerful anti-foreign, anti-corruption sentiment. The Donghak rebels sought to reform society from the ground up, to save Korea from both internal decay and external encroachment. The Joseon court, unable to quell the rebellion on its own, made a fatal decision. It requested military assistance from Qing China. This invitation, a desperate plea for help, was precisely the opening Japan had been waiting for. Japan, which had undergone its own rapid modernization during the Meiji Restoration, had developed a fierce imperial ambition, seeing Korea as a crucial stepping stone to continental power and a buffer against Russian expansion. They too dispatched troops, ostensibly to protect their interests, but with a much larger agenda. What followed was nothing short of cataclysmic for Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Fought largely on Korean soil, this war utterly reshaped the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. Japan, with its modern army and navy, dealt a humiliating defeat to China. The Treaty of Shimonoseki officially ended China's centuries-old suzerainty over Korea, declaring Korea an independent state. But this quote 7 was a cruel illusion. Korea had merely exchanged one patron for another, and the new one was far more demanding and intrusive. Think about this for a second. For millennia, Korea had maintained a delicate balance, often influenced by China but always fiercely protective of its distinct identity. Now, in a blink of an eye, that centuries-old order was shattered. Japan, a rising sun in the east, was asserting its dominance, and Korea was the primary prize. In a desperate attempt to assert true sovereignty and modernize, King Gojong declared the Korean Empire in 1897, elevating himself to emperor. It was a bold, symbolic move, an attempt to stand on equal footing with the empires of the world. He initiated reforms, sought to build a modern military, and even tried to play the great powers against each other, Russia, America, and Japan. But the geopolitical currents were too strong, the internal weaknesses too profound. Korea was becoming a chess piece on a global board, its fate decided by players far more powerful. The next blow came swiftly. Russia, with its own ambitions in Manchuria and Korea, became the next obstacle to Japan's expansion. The stage was set for another major conflict, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Again, the war was fought, in part, on and around the Korean Peninsula. And again, the outcome was shocking. Japan defeated a major European power. This victory solidified Japan's position as the preeminent power in East Asia, effectively giving it a green light from the Western powers to pursue its interests in Korea. The path to annexation was now clear and brutally swift. In 1905, under duress and with its diplomatic sovereignty stripped away, Korea was forced to sign the Ulsa Treaty, making it a Japanese protectorate. This meant Korea lost its right to conduct foreign policy, with Japan taking control of its external affairs. Emperor Gojong's desperate pleas to the international community fell on deaf ears. The world had moved on, and Korea was deemed a lost cause. Finally, in 1910, the inevitable happened. Japan formally annexed Korea, ending the Joseon dynasty and Korea's independent existence after over 500 years. The Korean Empire was abolished, and the peninsula became a colony, renamed, quote, "For the Korean people, this was not just a political shift. It was an existential catastrophe. A nation with a continuous history stretching back thousands of years had been swallowed whole. The period of Japanese colonial rule, 1910 to 1945, was a dark and brutal chapter, profoundly shaping the Korean identity and critically laying some of the groundwork for the future division we're still trying to understand. Japan's colonial policy was one of systematic assimilation and exploitation. Their goal wasn't just to control Korea, it was to erase Korea. They immediately began a campaign to suppress Korean culture and identity. The Korean language was gradually forbidden in schools, replaced by Japanese. Korean history was removed from curricula, replaced with a Japanese-centric narrative. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, a profound insult to a culture deeply rooted in ancestral lineage. Shinto shrines, symbols of Japanese imperial ideology, were built across the peninsula, and Koreans were compelled to worship at them. This wasn't just about control, it was an assault on the very soul of the Korean people, an attempt to turn them into Japanese subjects. Economically, Korea was ruthlessly exploited to fuel Japan's industrial and military expansion. Vast tracts of land were seized, often dispossessing Korean farmers who had tilled the same soil for generations. Korean rice, minerals, and other resources were systematically extracted and shipped to Japan. While Japan did build infrastructure, railways, roads, ports, factories, these were primarily designed to facilitate the rapid extraction of resources and the movement of Japanese goods and troops, not for the benefit of the Korean people. Korean labor was cheap and abundant, often forced into harsh conditions. Politically, the rule was authoritarian. Dissent was met with brutal suppression. The military police maintained a tight grip on society, and any expression of Korean nationalism was severely punished. Yet, despite this iron fist, the spirit of the Korean people, that deep-seated resilience we've seen throughout their history, never died. Think of the March 1st movement in 1919, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points and the concept of national self-determination. Millions of Koreans rose up in peaceful demonstrations across the peninsula, demanding independence. It was a truly remarkable display of national unity and courage, met with horrific violence by the Japanese authorities. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands arrested, but the movement, though brutally crushed, ignited a flame of resistance that would burn for the next 2 decades. Korean independence movements formed both within the peninsula and abroad, particularly in China and the Soviet Union. Provisional governments were established in exile, advocating for Korea's freedom on the international stage. Guerrilla fighters, often operating in Manchuria, continued to harass Japanese forces. This period forged a generation of Korean nationalists, individuals who, despite their differences in ideology, shared one common, burning desire: to see Korea free again. This long, painful colonial period, stretching for 35 years, left an indelible mark. It stripped Korea of its sovereignty, suppressed its culture, and exploited its resources. But it also hardened the Korean resolve, strengthened their sense of unique identity, and created a complex web of political ideologies and resistance movements that would profoundly influence the post-liberation landscape. As World War II raged and the eventual defeat of Japan became increasingly likely, the question shifted from if Korea would be liberated to how and by whom. And it is in the chaotic final days of that global conflict that the seeds of the unbelievable bifurcation, the division of a single ancient nation into 2 utterly distinct states, were sown. We're only just beginning to understand how a unified, resilient people, after centuries of fighting for their identity, would find themselves on opposite sides of a rapidly solidifying ideological divide. And that, my friends, is where our journey takes us next, to the very moment of liberation and the fateful decisions that would forever split the Korean Peninsula. The brutal Japanese colonial period, a dark chapter that seemed to extinguish the very flame of Korean identity, finally drew to a close with the cataclysmic end of World War II. For 35 long years, Korea had suffered under a relentless occupation, designed not just to exploit its resources, but to erase its soul. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, forbidden to speak their own language in schools, and compelled to worship at Shinto shrines. Their land was stripped bare, their people subjected to forced labor and unimaginable indignities. The very essence of being Korean was suppressed, yet the spirit of resistance, though often underground, never truly died. Then, abruptly, the world shifted. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed swiftly by the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, brought about an abrupt and total Japanese surrender in August 1945. For the Korean people, this wasn't just the end of a war. It was the dawn of a new era, a liberation they had fought and yearned for over those 35 agonizing years. Imagine the euphoria that swept through the peninsula, the spontaneous street celebrations, the tearful reunions, the defiant shouts of, quote, 9 long live Korea, quote, echoing through towns and villages. People danced in the streets, waving newly unfurled Korean flags, many of which had been hidden for decades. Families, once forced to whisper their heritage, now openly embraced their identity, sharing stories of resilience and hope. The belief that a sovereign, unified Korea, free to determine its own destiny, was finally within reach felt like a dream come true, a divine recompense for years of suffering. The air crackled with anticipation, a collective sigh of relief, and an overwhelming sense of national rebirth. But history, as we've seen, rarely offers simple, unblemished victories, the circumstances of Korea's quote-10 were, in a tragic twist of fate, the very seeds of its unbelievable bifurcation. This wasn't a liberation won solely by Korean hands, born purely from their struggle, but one dictated by the geopolitical chess match playing out on the global stage. The great powers, far removed from the daily lives and aspirations of the Korean people, were already redrawing maps and spheres of influence. Think about this for a second. For millennia, the Korean Peninsula had been a single, albeit sometimes internally fractured, cultural and political entity. Its people shared a language as ancient as their mountains, a history etched in the crucible of countless invasions and remarkable resilience, a heritage woven through generations of shared traditions, festivals and family structures, from the bustling markets of Seoul to the serene fishing villages of the north. There was a profound sense of shared identity. How then could it be so utterly, irrevocably torn in two? The answer lies in those fateful days of August 1945 and the Cold War storm that was rapidly gathering momentum. The very moment of their perceived freedom became the moment their fate was wrestled from their grasp. As Japan crumbled, two global superpowers, former allies against the Axis, now eyed each other with suspicion across a rapidly shrinking world. To the north, Soviet forces, having swept through Manchuria, poured into the Korean Peninsula, ostensibly to disarm the Japanese. Their columns of tanks and soldiers moved swiftly, establishing control with practiced efficiency. To the south, American forces, somewhat belatedly, landed to do the same, their ships docking in southern ports weeks after the initial Soviet advance. The initial plan, a hastily drawn agreement between two young American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, and Soviet military leadership, was a provisional one: divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel. This line, a mere cartographical convenience drawn on a National Geographic map, was meant to be a temporary administrative boundary for disarming Japanese troops. It was never intended to cleave a nation in half. Temporary, they said, just until order is restored, the radio broadcasts announced. But even then, a chill of unease spread among those who heard the news. "A line?" muttered an elderly farmer in Hwanghae province, looking south towards the fields he had always known as home. "How can they draw a line through our very blood?" But what began as a temporary demarcation quickly calcified into an impenetrable barrier. The 38th parallel became more than a line on a map. It became the physical manifestation of the emerging Cold War, a stark ideological frontier. Checkpoints sprang up, manned by foreign soldiers, then by Korean proxies, their uniforms and loyalties starkly different. What had been a mere administrative suggestion rapidly transformed into concrete walls, barbed wire and armed guards. Families found themselves arbitrarily separated, unable to cross even to visit relatives just kilometers away. The initial confusion gave way to frustration, then to a dawning, terrifying realization that this temporary division was becoming permanent. To the north, under Soviet influence, a communist system began to take root, nurtured by Moscow's ideological fervor and strategic ambition. To the south, the Americans championed a democratic capitalist model, convinced it was the only bulwark against the perceived global communist threat. The Korean people, who had just thrown off one colonial master, suddenly found themselves caught between two new, powerful patrons, each with a radically different vision for their future. They were no longer subjects of Japan, but pawns in a global game of chess, their homeland a critical square on the board. One prominent Korean intellectual, reflecting on the situation, wrote in his diary, quote 16, "It's a profound irony, isn't it? After centuries of striving for independence, of fighting to preserve their unique identity against powerful neighbours, the Koreans were denied the fundamental right to self-determination at the very moment of their supposed freedom. We see the resilient Korean spirit, yes, but now it's tragically divided, forced to adapt to two diametrically opposed worlds. In the north, the Soviets quickly moved to consolidate power, installing a young, charismatic anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung as the head of a provisional government. Kim Il-sung, a figure forged in the fires of resistance against the Japanese in Manchuria, was presented to the populace as a national hero, a liberator who would usher in a new era of socialist prosperity. Soviet advisors guided his every move, helping him purge potential rivals and establish a firm grip on the nascent state. Under Soviet guidance, a powerful, centralized Communist Party was established, its ranks swiftly filled with those loyal to the new order. Sweeping land reforms were enacted, seizing property from landlords and distributing it among landless peasants, a move that initially garnered popular support but simultaneously crushed the traditional social structure. The foundations of a totalitarian state, one where information was controlled, dissent was swiftly crushed, and loyalty to the leader was paramount, began to form with chilling efficiency. The emphasis was on yushe, or self-reliance, though in practice, it was deeply reliant on Soviet patronage initially. The message was clear. A new dawn had broken, guided by the great leader and the wisdom of Moscow. Meanwhile, in the south, the American military government faced a more complex and often chaotic landscape. They grappled with a multitude of returning independence fighters, political factions ranging from ardent communists to staunch conservatives, and a populace eager for immediate self-rule. Demonstrations, strikes, and even political assassinations were common, reflecting the deep divisions within Korean society itself. American officials, many of whom understood little of Korean culture or history, struggled to maintain order and identify a stable, pro-Western leader amidst the turmoil. The Americans, wary of Soviet expansion and determined to establish a bulwark against communism in Asia, eventually threw their weight behind Syngman Rhee. Rhee was an elder statesman of the independence movement, educated in the West, having spent decades in exile in the United States and fiercely anti-communist. Though he spoke eloquently of democracy and freedom, Rhee was known for his authoritarian tendencies, his iron will, and his willingness to suppress opposition, often brutally, to secure and maintain his power. He saw himself as the indispensable leader, the only man capable of guiding Korea to its rightful place. So, by 1948, the temporary division had hardened into an undeniable reality. In August, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was formally established in the south, with Syngman Rhee as its first president, celebrated with parades and the raising of the Taegyuki flag. A month later, in September, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was proclaimed in the north, with Kim Il-sung at its helm, marked by fervent rallies and declarations of socialist triumph. Two Koreas, one people, one peninsula, but two radically different, mutually hostile states, each claiming to be the sole legitimate government of the entire Korean nation. The sense of finality was palpable, a heavy curtain drawn across the heart of a nation. Imagine the tension, the palpable fear, the incessant propaganda from both sides demonizing the other. Loudspeakers blared across the 38th parallel, each side accusing the other of being puppets, traitors, and oppressors. Families were ripped apart by the 38th parallel, unable to cross. A mother in Kaesong might hear the distant cries of her grandchild on the southern side, but the physical barrier, now guarded by armed soldiers, was insurmountable. The vibrant, bustling energy of the South, even in its nascent form, with its burgeoning market economy and diverse political voices, was already starting to diverge starkly from the tightly controlled, ideologically driven North, where every aspect of life was orchestrated by the state. Both Ri and Kim Il-sung shared one absolute conviction: the unification of Korea. But critically, each believed it had to be unification on their own terms. Ri envisioned a unified, democratic, capitalist Korea under his leadership, free from the shackles of communism. Kim Il-sung dreamed of a unified communist Korea under his, liberated from what he viewed as American imperialist influence and the vestiges of feudalism. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was an existential clash, fueled by fervent nationalism and the potent ideologies of the Cold War, each leader convinced of their own righteousness and the absolute evil of the other. The rhetoric grew sharper, the mutual loathing deeper. Border skirmishes along the 38th parallel became increasingly frequent and violent. Patrols clashed, artillery exchanges shook the border villages, and propaganda leaflets, often attached to balloons, drifted across the divide. Each side launched raids, psychological warfare campaigns, and intelligence-gathering missions against the other, testing defences and probing weaknesses. The withdrawal of most American and Soviet occupation forces by mid-1949 further exacerbated the situation, creating a dangerous power vacuum that both leaders were eager to fill. Kim Il-sung, believing the time was ripe and with assurances of support from Stalin and Mao Zedong, who initially harboured some reservations but eventually relented to Kim's persistent lobbying, began to aggressively lobby for a military solution. He saw an opportunity to unify Korea by force, certain that the South Korean government was weak, unpopular, and that the Americans would not intervene significantly to protect it. This period, from 1945 to 1950, was a ticking time bomb, each minute bringing the peninsula closer to an inevitable explosion. The, quote, 17 had inadvertently set the stage for one of the most brutal and devastating conflicts of the 20th century. The ancient land of Korea, which had endured so much, was about to become a battleground once more, not against foreign invaders seeking conquest, but in a horrific civil war that would forever scar its people and solidify the division that endures to this very day. The question wasn't if war would come, but when and how utterly destructive it would be. And as we'll explore, the answer to that question would redefine the Korean Peninsula, creating the two utterly distinct nations we know today: the bustling, hyper-connected democracy of South Korea and the isolated, enigmatic state of North Korea. The stage was set, the players in place, and the fuse, well, it was practically smoking. Kim Il-sung, emboldened by Stalin's reluctant approval and Mao's promise of support, was convinced that the South Korean regime, propped up by the Americans, would crumble with a swift, decisive strike. He believed the Korean people yearned for unification under his banner, and that a short, sharp war would achieve what diplomacy and political maneuvering had failed to. Syngman Rhee, equally fervent in his anti-communism and his own desire to unify the peninsula under the South's leadership, was also making aggressive noises, though his military was far less prepared for an offensive war. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. On June 25, 1950, that fuse finally ignited. North Korean People's Army, KPE, forces, numbering around 135,000 men, equipped with Soviet T-34 tanks, artillery and air support, streamed across the 38th parallel. It was a brutal, full-scale invasion, launched under the cover of a pre-dawn artillery barrage. Imagine the shock, the terror for the people living near that arbitrary line, suddenly caught in the maw of a modern war. South Korean defences, caught completely off guard, were swiftly overwhelmed. The ROK army was smaller, less experienced, and lacked heavy weaponry. Within 3 days, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell. Can you imagine? The heart of a nation, captured in a blink. The speed and ferocity of the North Korean advance were staggering, pushing the beleaguered ROK forces and the handful of American advisors further and further south, threatening to sweep them right off the peninsula. This wasn't just a regional conflict. It was an immediate, terrifying test for the fledgling post-World War II global order. President Harry S. Truman, viewing the invasion as an act of Soviet-backed communist aggression, made a swift, decisive call. He committed US forces to defend South Korea, framing it as a crucial stand against the spread of communism, the first major military action of the Cold War. But it wasn't just the US, the United Nations Security Council, in a crucial moment, made possible by the Soviet Union's boycott of the Council over Taiwan's representation, passed Resolution 82, condemning North Korea's actions and calling for military assistance to South Korea. This was unprecedented. For the first time, an international body was sanctioning collective military action to repel aggression. 16 nations, including Britain, Canada, Australia and Turkey, would eventually contribute combat troops, with medical and logistical support from many more. This was truly a global response, a testament to the fear of unchecked aggression in a world still reeling from the horrors of the Second World War. The first American troops, ill-prepared and under-equipped, were thrown into the fight, often in desperate holding actions. They were pushed back, alongside the South Koreans, into a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Busan, known as the Busan Perimeter. It was a desperate, nail-biting period. The fate of South Korea, and perhaps the future of international collective security, hung by a thread. Had the perimeter fallen, the entire peninsula might have been unified under Kim Il-sung's communist rule, but the combined UN and ROK forces dug in, holding the line through brutal fighting, buying precious time. Then came the audacious, almost unbelievable gamble that turned the tide, the Incheon landing. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of UN forces, proposed a daring amphibious invasion far behind North Korean lines at the port of Incheon. Many thought it was madness. The tides were treacherous, the terrain difficult, the risks immense. But MacArthur, a man known for his dramatic flair and strategic brilliance, insisted. On September 15th, 1950, Thousands of US Marines and Army soldiers stormed the beaches of Incheon, catching the North Koreans completely by surprise. This wasn't just a landing, it was a strategic masterpiece. The landing cut off the KPA supply lines, effectively trapping the North Korean forces that had pushed so far south. Within days, Seoul was recaptured. The momentum of the war had dramatically shifted. With their supply lines severed and their forces reeling, the North Korean army began a desperate retreat. The UN and ROK forces, now on the offensive, chased them northward, crossing the 38th parallel in October 1950. The euphoria was palpable. It seemed as though the war would be over quickly, that Korea would be unified, not under Kim Il-sung, but under the democratic South, perhaps even before Christmas. The objective initially was to restore the status quo ante bellum, to push the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel. But with victory seemingly within reach, the temptation to push further, to dismantle the North Korean regime entirely, was irresistible. UN forces, led by the US, advanced rapidly towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. But history, as we know, loves its dramatic twists. As UN forces approached the Yalu, a new formidable player entered the game: China. Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China, had repeatedly warned that he would not tolerate a hostile American-aligned force on his border. His warnings were largely dismissed by MacArthur and the Truman administration, who underestimated China's resolve and capability. They paid a heavy price for that miscalculation. In late October and early November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese, quote, 18 soldiers, crossing the Yalu under the cover of darkness, launched a massive surprise counter-offensive. These were not poorly equipped peasants. These were hardened veterans, experienced from decades of civil war, fighting with fierce determination. The Chinese intervention completely reversed the war's trajectory. The UN and ROK forces, stretched thin and unprepared for such overwhelming numbers, were forced into a desperate, brutal retreat in freezing winter conditions. Think of the iconic images of soldiers fighting their way out of the Chosin Reservoir, battling both the enemy and the unforgiving Korean winter. It was a harrowing, devastating reversal. Seoul fell again to communist forces in January 1951, only to be recaptured by UN forces later that spring. The front line stabilized roughly around the 38th parallel, oscillating back and forth in a brutal, bloody stalemate that would last for the next 2 years. The war devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate, characterized by trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, fierce artillery duels, and pitched battles over strategic hills. The objectives changed from unification to simply holding the line, inflicting maximum damage, and gaining leverage for negotiations. This was a war of attrition, fought with immense human cost. Millions of lives were lost. An estimated 2 to 4 million Koreans, both civilian and military, perished. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers died, and over 36,000 Americans. The entire peninsula was utterly devastated. Cities were reduced to rubble, infrastructure obliterated, and families torn apart. Imagine the suffering, the sheer, unimaginable scale of destruction on a land that had already endured so much. Finally, after 2 years of agonizing negotiation, marked by bitter disagreements over prisoner exchanges and the precise demarcation of the ceasefire line, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, in Panmunjom. It was a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. This is crucial. The Korean War never officially ended. It was simply paused. The armistice established a demilitarized zone, DMZ, a 250-kilometer-long, 4-kilometer-wide strip of land that remains the most heavily fortified border in the world today. This line, a few miles north of the 38th parallel, solidified the division of the peninsula into two hostile states. The immediate consequences were profound and heartbreaking. Millions of families found themselves permanently separated, cut off from loved ones by an impassable barrier, often with no knowledge of their relatives' fates. The devastation was absolute, leaving both North and South Korea in ruins. But the war didn't just divide a land, it forged two fundamentally antagonistic identities. In the North, the war was framed as a heroic struggle against American imperialism, a narrative that cemented Kim Il-sung's totalitarian rule and fueled the ideology of juche, self-reliance, even while relying heavily on Soviet and Chinese aid. The constant threat of renewed aggression from the South and its American allies became the bedrock of state propaganda, justifying immense military spending and tight social control. In the South, the war solidified a deep-seated anti-communism and a strong alliance with the United States. Syngman Rhee's authoritarian tendencies were reinforced by the exigencies of war, and the dream of unification under liberal democracy was deferred, replaced by the immediate need for security and rebuilding. The peninsula, once a unified cultural entity for millennia, was now irrevocably split, not just by a line on a map, but by a chasm of ideology, trauma, and unyielding hostility. The Korean War was a crucible, burning away any remaining hope for peaceful reunification and hardening the resolve of two diametrically opposed systems. The peninsula was devastated, but the story of how these two halves would rebuild and diverge even further was only just beginning. The ink on the armistice agreement was barely dry, but the silence that fell over the Korean Peninsula on July 27, 1953, was not one of peace, but of utter exhaustion. The war had ended, but it hadn't resolved anything. Instead, it had cemented a brutal ideological division, leaving behind a landscape of unimaginable devastation. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, and millions of lives had been lost. An estimated 3 million Koreans, 1 million Chinese, and tens of thousands of UN soldiers. Imagine a country where nearly every major building was damaged or destroyed, where families were irrevocably split, and where the trauma of total war seeped into the very soil. This was the inheritance of both North and South Korea. From this shared starting point of rubble and despair, two profoundly different futures began to unfold, like two seedlings planted in the same scorched earth, yet destined to grow into vastly different trees. How can two nations sharing a common history, language, and culture for millennia diverge so utterly in just a few decades? That's the question we're grappling with now, as we dive into the post-armistice era. North Korea, the rise of the Hermit Kingdom and juche. In the north, under the watchful eye of the Soviet Union and China, Kim Il-sung wasted no time consolidating his power. The war for him wasn't just a military defeat. It was a crucible that forged his vision for a truly independent, self-reliant communist state. He systematically purged any rivals, those who had sided with the Soviets, those who had ties to China, and even domestic communists who didn't fully subscribe to his unique brand of leadership. By the late 1950s, Kim Il-sung stood virtually unchallenged, the undisputed leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. His ideology, Yuch, which translates roughly to self-reliance, became the guiding principle of the state. Think of it as a radical form of nationalism married to a totalitarian interpretation of communism. Juche wasn't just an economic policy. It was a philosophical declaration that North Korea must develop its own strength, solve its own problems, and reject all foreign interference, whether from the West or even its socialist allies. This wasn't merely a political slogan, it was a worldview that permeated every aspect of North Korean society, from agriculture to art, from education to military strategy. Initial reconstruction efforts in the North were surprisingly effective. With substantial aid from the Soviet Union and China, and a highly centralized command economy, North Korea prioritized heavy industry. Factories were rebuilt, dams constructed, and a disciplined workforce was mobilized for national development. For a time in the immediate post-war years, North Korea actually boasted a stronger industrial base, and in some metrics a higher standard of living than its southern counterpart. This early success was crucial for legitimizing Kim Il-sung's rule and demonstrating the supposed superiority of the Juche system. But this economic model came at a steep price. The state became everything. Individual freedoms were non-existent. Information was tightly controlled, and a pervasive personality cult began to blossom around Kim Il-sung, portraying him as a superhuman leader, the Quote 20, who had single-handedly liberated Korea and was guiding it to prosperity. This wasn't just propaganda, it was the foundation of a new national myth, a narrative that would shape generations. The regime created an internal logic so absolute, so all-encompassing, that dissent became unthinkable, and the outside world was increasingly viewed with suspicion and hostility. North Korea was slowly, deliberately pulling up the drawbridge, transforming into the hermit kingdom of the modern age. South Korea, from rubble to miracle on the Iron River. Meanwhile, in the south, the situation was equally dire, though politically distinct. Syngman Rhee, the fiercely anti-communist leader installed by the Americans, remained in power. But his rule quickly became characterized by corruption, authoritarianism, and a glaring lack of economic progress. While the North was building factories, the South languished, heavily reliant on US aid and struggling to establish a stable economy. The post-war years under Rhee were marked by political instability, suppression of opposition, and a general sense of stagnation. Poverty was widespread, and the promise of a democratic, prosperous South seemed distant. The Korean War had solidified South Korea's alliance with the United States, but it hadn't magically transformed the nation into a vibrant democracy overnight. Rhee clung to power, amending the constitution to allow himself multiple terms and rigging elections. This blatant disregard for democratic principles, coupled with a stagnant economy and growing public discontent, eventually reached a boiling point. In April 1960, a massive student-led uprising known as the April Revolution erupted across the country. Thousands of students took to the streets, protesting Rhee's autocratic rule and electoral fraud. The protests were met with violence, but the sheer scale and intensity of the movement ultimately forced Syngman Rhee to resign and flee into exile. It was a powerful, if brief, moment of popular triumph, demonstrating the Korean people's deep yearning for genuine democracy and justice. However, the democratic government that followed was short-lived and unstable. A year later, in May 1961, Major General Park Chung-hee led a military coup, overthrowing the civilian government. Park, a controversial figure who had served in the Japanese Imperial Army during the colonial period and later fought against communists in the Korean War, seized power, promising stability and economic development. He declared martial law, suppressed political opposition, and ushered in an era of authoritarian rule that would last nearly 2 decades. This is where the South Korean story truly begins its dramatic economic transformation. Park Chung-hee, despite his autocratic tendencies, was an economic pragmatist with a clear vision, export-oriented industrialization. He understood that South Korea, lacking natural resources, had to, quote, 23. He forged a strong, albeit often brutal, partnership between the government and a select group of large family-owned conglomerates, known as chaebols. Think Hyundai, Samsung, LG. The government provided subsidies, cheap loans and protection, while the chaebols focused on producing goods for export, initially light industrial products like textiles and wigs, and later shifting to heavier industries like shipbuilding, steel and electronics. This wasn't a free market democracy in the Western sense. It was a state-led development model, often referred to as developmental dictatorship. Workers' rights were suppressed, dissent was crushed, and the military maintained a pervasive presence in society. Yet, the economic results were undeniable and astonishing. South Korea's economy grew at an incredible pace, often exceeding 10% annually. What we now call the quote 25 quote was taking shape. From a war-torn, impoverished nation, South Korea was rapidly industrializing, transforming itself into an economic powerhouse. Its cities, particularly Seoul, began to buzz with activity, skyscrapers rising from the ashes, a testament to the nation's ingenuity and sheer will. The Great Divergence. 2 paths, 1 people. It's almost astonishing, isn't it, to consider that these 2 nations, born from the same crucible of war and division, facing similar levels of devastation in 1953, chose such fundamentally different paths. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the divergence was already stark and undeniable. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, was a society built on absolute self-reliance, military strength, and ideological purity. Its economy, while initially robust, began to falter as the Juche philosophy prioritized heavy industry and military spending over consumer goods and agricultural development. The country became increasingly isolated. Its people fed a constant diet of anti-American propaganda and veneration of the great leader. The information curtain was impenetrable, creating a society that was both fiercely independent and profoundly cut off from the rest of the world. South Korea, under Park Chung-hee, was a nation driven by rapid economic growth and integration into the global economy, albeit under an iron fist. Its alliance with the United States provided crucial security and economic assistance, and its chaebol-led export strategy proved incredibly successful. While political freedoms were severely curtailed, the promise of economic prosperity offered a different kind of legitimacy. The bustling streets of Seoul, with their nascent skyscrapers and burgeoning industries, stood in stark contrast to the vast dark expanse that was becoming North Korea. We have two narratives unfolding simultaneously, two experiments in nation building. One, a totalitarian state founded on a unique brand of self-reliance, consolidating power and creating an unshakable cult of personality. The other, an authoritarian regime prioritizing economic development at all costs, laying the foundation for a future democratic and economic powerhouse. Both were driven by a fierce sense of national pride and a determination to rebuild, but their methods, their ideologies, and ultimately their destinies were pulling them further and further apart. The 1970s would bring new challenges and shifts in the global landscape, testing both Koreas in different ways. The economic gap would widen dramatically, and the political systems, though both authoritarian, would face internal pressures that would eventually lead to very different outcomes. But for now, let's just pause and reflect on this profound divergence, a testament to how ideology, leadership, and external forces can sculpt the fate of a nation, taking a single people and splitting them into two worlds. The stage is set for an even greater disparity, and the consequences, as we'll see, would be far-reaching and continue to define the peninsula to this very day. The 1970s dawned on a Korean peninsula more deeply divided than ever before, a chasm not just of ideology, but of lived experience. South Korea, fueled by these, quote, sixes, was a nation on a relentless climb, its factories humming, its cities expanding, its people dreaming of prosperity. But this economic boom came at a steep political price, one that would test the very soul of the burgeoning nation. Think about this for a second. You have a nation, South Korea, pulling itself from the ashes of war, achieving economic feats that dazzled the world. Yet its political landscape remained a volatile mix of aspiration and repression. President Park Chung-hee, the architect of this economic miracle, was a man of iron will and unwavering conviction. He believed, perhaps genuinely, that strong, centralized leadership was essential for national survival and continued growth. Democracy, he argued, was a luxury Korea couldn't yet afford, and so, in 1972, Park tightened his grip with the implementation of the Yushin Constitution. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a constitutional coup. Martial law was declared, the National Assembly was dissolved, and the existing constitution was suspended. When the dust settled, South Korea found itself under a system that granted Park virtually unlimited powers. He could be elected president for life through an indirect electoral college, appoint a third of the National Assembly, and effectively control the judiciary. Freedom of the press and assembly were severely curtailed, and dissent was met with swift, brutal force. The justification? National security and economic stability. While the economy continued its dizzying ascent, the vibrant, hyper-connected democracy we know today was still a distant dream, suppressed under the weight of an authoritarian state. The paradox was stark. South Korea was building skyscrapers and exporting goods globally, but its citizens were increasingly clamoring for fundamental rights. Students, intellectuals, and a growing middle class, emboldened by the nation's newfound prosperity and exposure to the outside world, began to demand genuine democracy. Protests simmered and occasionally boiled over, met always by Park's resolute, often violent suppression. The tension was palpable, a constant hum beneath the surface of bustling cities. This pressure cooker eventually exploded. On October 26, 1979, after nearly 2 decades in power, Park Chung-hee was assassinated by his own intelligence chief Kim Jae-gyu during a private dinner. The details are still debated, but the act plunged South Korea into a period of profound uncertainty. A brief, tantalizing moment where the path to democracy seemed finally open. But history, as we've learned, rarely follows a straight line. The hope for a democratic transition was cruelly short-lived. Just weeks after Park's death, another military general, Chun Do-hwan, staged a coup d'état on December 12, 1979, seizing control and snuffing out the nascent democratic aspirations. Chun, like Park before him, believed in the efficacy of military rule, citing the need for stability in a dangerous geopolitical neighborhood. The full weight of Chun's authoritarianism crashed down in May 1980 with the infamous Gwangju Uprising. When students in the city of Gwangju protested against Chun's coup and martial law, the military responded with unimaginable brutality. Paratroopers were deployed, firing indiscriminately into crowds, beating civilians and laying siege to the city. For days, the citizens of Gwangju fought back, forming militias, broadcasting calls for help, and enduring a horrifying crackdown that left hundreds, perhaps thousands, dead. The images of Gwangju, the bloodied streets, the defiant citizens, the sheer scale of the military's violence, remain a profound scar on the South Korean psyche. It was a crucible of suffering that forged an unshakable resolve for democracy, a blood-stained banner that would galvanize future movements. Despite the Gwangju tragedy, Chun Do-hwan consolidated his power, continuing the pattern of economic growth under political repression throughout the early 1980s. South Korea's industries continued to expand, its exports soared, and its global presence grew. Yet, the memory of Gwangju festered, and the demand for genuine democratic participation only grew stronger. The global spotlight was also beginning to turn towards South Korea, particularly with the announcement that Seoul would host the 1988 Summer Olympics. This international visibility put immense pressure on Chun's regime to liberalize. And then it happened. In 1987, a series of events, including the tortured death of a student activist named Park Jong-chul, sparked outrage across the nation. This ignited the Sejun democracy movement, a nationwide wave of massive protests involving millions of citizens from all walks of life, students, workers, professionals, and the burgeoning middle class. They marched, they rallied, they chanted, demanding direct presidential elections and fundamental constitutional reform. The images of tear gas-filled streets and citizens facing down riot police became iconic, demonstrating a collective will that even the military could not suppress. The government, facing unprecedented domestic pressure and international scrutiny just ahead of the Olympics, finally yielded. On June 29, 1987, Roh Tae-woo, Chun's chosen successor, issued the June 29th Declaration, agreeing to a direct presidential election and a new democratic constitution. It was a monumental victory for the Korean people, a testament to their enduring faith in democratic ideals, and the true birth of modern South Korean democracy. From that moment, the vibrant, hyper-connected democracy we observe today began its journey, a testament to resilience and the power of collective will. Now let's turn our gaze north, to the vast, dark expanse that was North Korea during these same decades. While South Korea was navigating the turbulent waters of economic growth and political upheaval, North Korea was charting a course into ever deeper isolation, its identity increasingly defined by the unique and terrifying ideology of Juche. In the 1970s and 80s, Kim Il-sung solidified his position not just as a leader, but as a demigod. The personality cult, already pervasive, became an all-encompassing quasi-religious system. Juche, the official state ideology of Quoted 27, was elevated to the highest guiding principle, replacing Marxism-Leninism in all but name. This wasn't just about economic independence, it was about intellectual, cultural, and spiritual self-sufficiency, a complete severing from outside influences. Every aspect of life, from education to agriculture, was interpreted through the lens of Juche, creating an insular world where Kim Il-sung's wisdom was the ultimate truth. Crucially, it was during this period that the world witnessed the unprecedented and frankly bizarre phenomenon of a communist state embarking on a hereditary succession. Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, was systematically groomed throughout the 1970s to take the reins. He began to assume more and more critical responsibilities, overseeing cultural affairs, propaganda, and eventually the party apparatus itself. This dynastic transfer of power, cementing the quote 28 as the rightful rulers of North Korea, was a stark rejection of traditional communist principles and further solidified the country's unique totalitarian trajectory. But even as the personality cult deepened and the succession was engineered, North Korea's command economy, once lauded by its communist allies, began to falter. The promise of Juche, that North Korea could thrive entirely on its own, proved to be a cruel myth. Heavy investment in the military, inefficient central planning, and a profound lack of innovation meant that while South Korea was surging ahead, North Korea was slowly but surely falling behind. The gap between the two Koreas, once a relatively even playing field, was becoming a canyon. Aid from the Soviet Union and China, critical lifelines for North Korea, began to dwindle, especially as both communist giants started to pursue their own reforms and engage more with the global economy. This left North Korea increasingly starved of resources and technology, its industrial base stagnating, its infrastructure crumbling. The vibrant growth of the 1950s and 60s was replaced by a creeping decline, masked by relentless propaganda and an iron curtain of information control. Meanwhile, North Korea continued its aggressive military posturing and provocative acts against the South and the international community. We saw the discovery of massive infiltration tunnels dug under the DMZ aimed at facilitating a surprise invasion. In 1976, the infamous axe murder incident in the DMZ saw 2 US officers brutally killed by North Korean soldiers. Later, in 1983, a bombing in Rangoon, Burma, targeting South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan, killed several high-ranking South Korean officials. And in 1987, a South Korean airliner, Korean Air Flight 858, was bombed over the Andaman Sea, killing all 115 people on board, an act attributed to North Korean agents. These were not random acts. They were calculated demonstrations of force designed to destabilize the South, project strength, and keep the world on edge, even as the regime itself faced growing internal challenges. The late 1980s brought a stark, almost cinematic contrast into focus, as South Korea celebrated its newfound democracy and showcased its economic prowess to the world by hosting the 1988 Seoul Olympics, a truly magnificent coming-out party on the global stage. North Korea remained shrouded in secrecy, its people isolated, its economy teetering. The Olympics were not just a sporting event, they were a powerful symbol, a definitive statement to the world about which path had yielded prosperity and freedom. Then came 1989, a year that shook the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall, followed swiftly by the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and eventually the Soviet Union itself. For North Korea, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. Its ideological allies, its economic patrons, and its diplomatic lifelines vanished almost overnight. The Cold War, which had provided a perverse kind of stability and support for the DPRK, was over. North Korea was left profoundly isolated, a solitary, anachronistic communist state in a rapidly changing world. The impact of this tectonic shift would reverberate through the peninsula for decades, setting the stage for even more profound challenges and an even deeper, more dangerous divergence between the two Koreas. The 1990s would bring new leaders, new crises, and the terrifying emergence of a nuclear threat. But the seeds of these future struggles were firmly planted in the contrasting trajectories of the 1970s and 80s. How could two nations, born of the same people and land, have diverged so utterly? And what would happen when one, emboldened by newfound freedom and prosperity, finally stood face to face with the other, increasingly desperate and isolated? The answer, as we're about to discover, would be both tragic and defining. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 didn't just mark the end of an era. For North Korea, it was an earthquake, a seismic shift that ripped away the very foundations of its existence. We left North Korea under the iron fist of Kim Il-sung, an anachronistic communist state deeply isolated. But what happened next was a descent into a humanitarian crisis so profound it's hard to fathom. Imagine, if you will, a nation built on the promise of self-reliance, of yush, suddenly finding itself utterly alone. Soviet aid, which had propped up its command economy for decades, vanished overnight. China, while still a nominal ally, was rapidly embracing market reforms and was less inclined to unconditionally subsidize its reclusive neighbor. This wasn't just a loss of political patronage. It was loss of oil, grain, industrial equipment, and the very lifeblood that kept the North Korean system afloat. The 1990s brought what North Korea euphemistically called the arduous march. In reality, it was a brutal, devastating famine that claimed an estimated hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. We're talking about a scale of suffering that rivals some of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century. Crops failed repeatedly due to a combination of natural disasters and, crucially, decades of agricultural mismanagement and the collectivized farming system. The food distribution system, designed for a military-first state, prioritized the elite, the party, and the military, leaving the vast majority of the population to starve. People ate grass, bark, even insects. Families were torn apart as individuals desperately searched for food. It was a period of unimaginable hardship, a stark, terrifying consequence of absolute isolation and a failed ideology. Think about the resilience of the Korean people we've discussed throughout history. Their ability to endure brutal invasions, colonial oppression. But this was different. This was a self-inflicted wound, a tragedy born from internal policies, Yet, even amidst this catastrophe, the regime of Kim Il-sung and later his son Kim Jong-il clung to power with an almost terrifying tenacity. The information blockade was so complete, the cult of personality so pervasive, that dissent was effectively stifled, even in the face of widespread death. This period cemented the Songun, or military-first policy, where the nation's meagre resources were funneled into its armed forces, even as its people withered. It was during this desperate period that North Korea's nuclear ambitions truly escalated. For a regime facing existential threats, economic collapse, diplomatic isolation, the spectre of a thriving democratic South Korea right on its doorstep, nuclear weapons became the ultimate guarantor of survival. They weren't just a bargaining chip. They were, in their eyes, the only thing standing between them and annihilation. The early 1990s saw the first major international crisis surrounding North Korea's nuclear program. As the world became aware of its efforts to develop weapons-grade plutonium, international alarm bells rang. This led to the 1994 Agreed Framework with the United States, an attempt to freeze North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for aid and the construction of light water reactors. It was a fragile peace, a testament to the international community's desperate hope to de-escalate a terrifying situation. But, as we now know, it was ultimately a temporary measure. While North Korea was grappling with famine and developing its nuclear program in the shadows, South Korea was embarking on a truly remarkable journey of its own. Having achieved a vibrant, robust democracy in 1987, it was now flexing its muscles on the global stage, not just economically, but politically and culturally. The 1990s weren't without their challenges for the South. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis swept through the region, hitting South Korea hard. Banks collapsed, companies went bankrupt, and the economy, which had seemed invincible, teetered on the brink. This was a moment of profound national anxiety. But here, again, we see the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the Korean people. The government under President Kim Dae-jung initiated sweeping reforms, embracing transparency and market liberalization. And the people, they responded with an astonishing act of national solidarity. Citizens lined up to donate their gold, wedding rings, heirlooms, even gold medals, to help the nation pay off its IMF debt. Think about that for a second. A collective act of sacrifice on such a scale, driven by a deep sense of national pride and a determination to overcome adversity. South Korea didn't just recover from the crisis, it emerged stronger, more agile, and more innovative. This period saw the rise of its tech giants, like Samsung and LG, becoming global leaders in electronics and telecommunications. It also laid the groundwork for something truly revolutionary, the Søster, quote, 30,000, or Hallyu. Suddenly, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, South Korean culture began to sweep across Asia, and eventually the world. K-dramas, with their compelling storylines and stylish production, captivated audiences from China to the Middle East. K-pop, with its infectious beats, slick choreography, and charismatic idols, became a global phenomenon, breaking down language barriers and topping charts from Seoul to Los Angeles. Think about the irony. A nation that was once known as the Yars, quote, 34, was now exporting its culture with unprecedented success, becoming a soft power superpower. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a powerful statement of South Korea's modernity creativity, and global appeal. It was a stark, vibrant contrast to the closed, dark world of its northern neighbour. Against this backdrop of extreme divergence, efforts were made to bridge the chasm. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, South Korea, under the leadership of Presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, pursued the, quote, 35, quote. The idea was simple, yet radical. Instead of confrontation, offer engagement. Instead of isolation, pursue reconciliation. The hope was that by fostering economic cooperation and cultural exchange, North Korea might gradually open up, leading to a more peaceful coexistence and, eventually, unification. This policy led to historic moments that captured the world's imagination. In 2000, Kim Dae-jung travelled to Pyongyang for the first ever inter-Korean summit with Kim Jong-il. Imagine the symbolism. The leaders of two nations, technically still at war, shaking hands. It was a moment filled with immense hope. Family reunions allowing brief, heartbreaking meetings between relatives separated since the Korean War brought tears to millions. Joint economic projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex, where South Korean companies employed North Korean workers, and tourism to Mount Kumgang offered tantalizing glimpses of a different future. But the Sunshine Policy, for all its noble intentions and emotional impact, faced an insurmountable challenge. North Korea's unwavering commitment to its nuclear program. While the South offered carrots, the North continued to develop its sticks. The agreed framework eventually collapsed, and North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first underground nuclear test, followed by another in 2009. These acts sent shockwaves across the globe, demonstrating that despite engagement, the regime's core strategic objective remained unchanged. The optimism of the Sunshine Policy began to wane, giving way to renewed tension and confrontation. In 2010, the sinking of the South Korean warship Cheonan, attributed to a North Korean torpedo, and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, which killed South Korean civilians and soldiers, shattered any lingering illusions of immediate reconciliation. The chasm between the two Koreas, rather than narrowing, seemed to be widening even further, becoming more dangerous with each passing year. Then, in December 2011, Kim Jong-il died, and his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, a relatively unknown figure in his late 20s, inherited the world's most secretive and dangerous state. The transition was smooth, a testament to the absolute power of the Kim dynasty, but it also signalled a new, even more aggressive chapter in North Korea's nuclear and missile development. The young leader quickly consolidated power, purging rivals and dramatically accelerating the country's weapons programs, conducting multiple nuclear tests, and launching a barrage of ballistic missiles, demonstrating capabilities that threatened not only South Korea and Japan, but potentially the United States mainland. So, here we stand, at a point in history where the divergence is almost complete. You have South Korea, a bustling, vibrant, hyper-connected democracy, a global leader in technology, culture and economy, its skyscrapers piercing the sky, its pop music echoing across continents. And then you have North Korea, isolated, authoritarian and opaque, its people largely cut off from the outside world, its economy perpetually struggling, and its primary claim to international attention being its increasingly dangerous nuclear arsenal. How can two nations, born from the same people, sharing thousands of years of history, have diverged so utterly, so completely, that they appear to be two different planets orbiting the same sun? This is the profound, terrifying question that defines the Korean Peninsula today. The armistice of 1953 still holds, but the underlying conflict, the ideological war, the existential struggle continues. And with North Korea's nuclear capabilities growing, the stakes have never been higher. What happens next, in this dramatic ongoing saga, is a story still being written, fraught with both peril and the enduring distant hope of a unified future. The enduring division of the Korean Peninsula, a wound left festering since the armistice of 1953, continued to cast its long shadow. We've seen how two nations, born from the same crucible of history, diverged into starkly different realities. One, a vibrant, hyper-connected democracy, the other an isolated authoritarian state. But the story doesn't end with the establishment of these two Koreas, or even with their initial dramatic post-war transformations. It's a narrative that continues to unfold, marked by periods of intense tension, fleeting moments of hope, and the ever-present, terrifying spectre of nuclear proliferation. Think about this for a second. A single people, a shared heritage stretching back millennia, yet split by an invisible line that became the world's most heavily fortified border. On one side, North Korea, under the hereditary rule of the Kim dynasty, made a fateful decision to pursue nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantor of its survival. This wasn't a sudden whim, it was a strategic pivot, deeply rooted in the Juche ideology of self-reliance and a profound distrust of the outside world, particularly the United States. Under Kim Jong-il, who inherited power in 1994, North Korea accelerated its clandestine nuclear program. We witnessed a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the international community. There were agreements, like the 1994 Agreed Framework, designed to freeze its nuclear ambitions in exchange for aid, but these often crumbled under the weight of mutual suspicion and North Korea's persistent pursuit of its goals. The turning point, perhaps, came in October 2006, when North Korea conducted its first underground nuclear test. This wasn't just a seismic event. It was an ideological earthquake, sending shockwaves across the globe and fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape of Northeast Asia. The world reacted with condemnation, sanctions, and calls for denuclearization. But the genie, it seemed, was out of the bottle. When Kim Jong-un took the reins in 2011 following his father's death, many observers speculated about a potential shift, a softening perhaps. Instead, what we saw was an unprecedented acceleration of both nuclear weapons and ballistic missile development. It was as if he was determined to prove his legitimacy and solidify his grip on power through sheer military might. We've watched, with a mixture of alarm and morbid fascination, as North Korea conducted multiple nuclear tests, each one more powerful than the last, culminating in its sixth and most powerful test in September 2017, which it claimed was a hydrogen bomb. Simultaneously, it test-fired an array of increasingly sophisticated missiles, short-range, medium-range, and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, theoretically capable of reaching the US mainland. Imagine the sheer audacity, the relentless drive in a nation so economically deprived to pour such immense resources into this singular, terrifying objective. The international community, led by the United States, China, South Korea, and Japan, struggled to formulate a coherent response. We saw rounds of multilateral talks, like the six-party talks, which included the US, China, Japan, Russia, and the two Koreas, attempt to negotiate denuclearization. But these efforts repeatedly stalled, primarily over verification mechanisms and North Korea's unwillingness to fully abandon what it considered its most crucial deterrent. Sanctions piled upon sanctions designed to cripple its economy and force a change in behavior, yet the regime, fueled by its Juche philosophy and an intricate network of illicit activities, proved remarkably resilient. The narrative from Pyongyang was clear. These weapons were non-negotiable, essential for defending against perceived hostile forces and a testament to their self-reliance. For North Korea, it was a matter of survival. For the rest of the world, it was a profound threat to regional and global peace. Meanwhile, on the southern half of the peninsula, South Korea was not just surviving, it was thriving, cementing its place as a truly global powerhouse. Having navigated the turbulent waters of democratization and weathered economic crises like the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Republic of Korea had emerged stronger, more resilient and more confident than ever before. If the 1980s and 90s were about economic miracles and democratic transitions, the early 21st century has been about cultural and technological dominance. We've all seen it, haven't we? The Quote 36, or Hallyu, swept across the world, captivating audiences from every continent. From the infectious beats of K-pop, with groups like BTS shattering global streaming records and selling out stadiums worldwide, to the compelling narratives of K-dramas that offered a fresh perspective on love, family and ambition, Korean culture became a global phenomenon. And it wasn't just music and television. Korean cinema, with films like Parasite winning the Palme d'Or and the Academy Award for Best Picture, demonstrated an unparalleled artistic vision and critical acclaim. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a powerful projection of soft power, showcasing South Korea's creativity, sophistication, and dynamism to an eager world. Beyond culture, South Korea continued its relentless march in technological innovation. Names like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai became household brands, synonymous with cutting-edge electronics, smartphones, and automobiles. This wasn't merely about manufacturing, it was about leading the charge in R&D, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in areas like 5G technology, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Seoul, a city that once lay in ruins, transformed into a dazzling futuristic metropolis, its skyline a testament to ingenuity and ambition, its streets bustling with a hyper-connected populace that embraced innovation with unparalleled enthusiasm. South Korea's vibrant democracy matured further, marked by peaceful transitions of power and a robust civil society that held its leaders accountable, even in times of scandal. It truly was a testament to the Korean people's unwavering drive for progress and excellence. Against this backdrop of North Korea's nuclear brinkmanship and South Korea's global ascendancy, inter-Korean relations remained a complex, often contradictory dance. The Stats Quote 37, initiated by President Kim Dae-jung in the late 1990s, had aimed to foster reconciliation and cooperation through engagement, rather than confrontation. It brought about historic inter-Korean summits, family reunions, and joint economic projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed as though the ice might finally be breaking. But as we know, that warmth proved ephemeral. North Korea's continued nuclear pursuits and provocations, such as the sinking of the South Korean warship Cheonan in 2010 and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island later that year, repeatedly plunged relations back into the deep freeze, shattering trust and reinforcing the deep ideological chasm. Yet the desire for peace and eventual reunification never entirely extinguished. We saw another surge of diplomatic activity in 2018, a remarkable year that brought 3 inter-Korean summits between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, alongside unprecedented meetings between Kim Jong-un and then US President Donald Trump. These summits, held in places like Panmunjom and Singapore, created iconic images of leaders shaking hands across the military demarcation line, fueling global optimism for a breakthrough. There was talk of denuclearization, of peace treaties, of a new era of cooperation. But again, the intricate web of mistrust, the fundamental disagreements over the pace and scope of denuclearization, and the lack of concrete, verifiable steps from North Korea ultimately led to a stalemate. The cycle of hope and disappointment, it seems, is a persistent feature of this deeply fractured relationship. The demilitarized zone, DMZ, that desolate strip of land stretching across the peninsula, remains the most potent symbol of this unresolved conflict. It is a place of stark contrasts, a heavily guarded frontier bristling with armaments, yet also a pristine wildlife sanctuary, untouched by human development for decades. But beyond its ecological significance, the DMZ represents the profound human cost of division. Millions of Koreans still live with the anguish of separated families, many of whom have grown old and passed away without ever seeing their loved ones again. The dream of reunification, once a fervent hope, has become a complex, almost daunting prospect, fraught with immense economic, social, and political challenges. How do you bridge such a vast ideological and developmental gap? How do you reconcile decades of divergent histories and narratives? As we stand at the present, the Korean Peninsula remains a geopolitical flashpoint. North Korea continues to refine its nuclear and missile capabilities, defying international sanctions and pushing the boundaries of conventional diplomacy. South Korea, a beacon of democracy and innovation, grapples with the constant threat from its northern neighbour, while continuing to assert its influence on the global stage. The question of how to manage North Korea's nuclear arsenal, how to foster genuine peace, and whether reunification could ever truly be achieved, are not just questions for the Korean people. They are critical challenges for the entire world. The story of the two Koreas is far from over. It is a living, breathing narrative, constantly evolving, reminding us of the profound impact of ideology, power, and human resilience on the destiny of nations. And as we look to the future, we're left to wonder, what chapters will be written next in this extraordinary, often heartbreaking saga? We left off contemplating the profound, almost unfathomable divergence of two nations born from the same historical crucible, separated by an arbitrary line that became a scar across the heart of a people. That line, the demilitarized zone, isn't just a physical barrier, it's a chasm of ideology, memory, and possibility. Today, in the 21st century, the story of the Korean Peninsula is less about ancient dynasties and more about a constant high-stakes negotiation with an uncertain future. It's a tale of two Koreas, each navigating its own destiny, yet inextricably linked by the very division that defines them. Think about this for a second. You have South Korea, a global powerhouse, a vibrant, hyper-connected democracy whose cultural exports, K-pop, K-dramas, cinema, gaming, captivate millions worldwide. Its technological innovations drive global markets, and its cities hum with an energy that's almost palpable. Then, just 35 miles north of Seoul, you have North Korea, a state so opaque, so isolated, it often feels like an anachronism, a holdover from a bygone era of total ideological control. Yet this hermit kingdom possesses a chillingly modern arsenal, a rapidly advancing nuclear weapons program, and an array of ballistic missiles capable of reaching distant shores. The Kim dynasty, now in its third generation under Kim Jong-un, has made it abundantly clear. Their nuclear program is not up for negotiation. We've witnessed a dramatic acceleration in their capabilities. From their first nuclear test in 2006 under Kim Jong-il, the program has evolved at an alarming pace. Under Kim Jong-un, we saw multiple more powerful nuclear tests, including what they claimed was a hydrogen bomb. We've seen an astonishing array of missile launches, demonstrating everything from short-range tactical weapons to intermediate-range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, and most concerningly intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of striking the US mainland. These tests are not just technical demonstrations. They are calculated provocations, designed to project strength, demand attention, and crucially secure the regime's survival. For North Korea, these weapons are their ultimate deterrent, their guarantee against perceived external threats, particularly from the United States and its allies. Yuch, that ideology of self-reliance, has taken on a terrifying new dimension, self-reliance in the face of annihilation, backed by the bomb. The international community, led by the United Nations Security Council, has responded with wave after wave of increasingly stringent sanctions, targeting everything from their coal exports to their financial networks. But here's the conundrum. While these sanctions undoubtedly inflict economic hardship on an already struggling populace, they haven't deterred the regime from its nuclear ambitions. In fact, many argue they have only hardened its resolve, reinforcing the narrative of a besieged nation needing its ultimate defense. Meanwhile, South Korea continues its breathtaking ascent on the global stage. Its economy, once devastated by war, is now the 10th largest in the world. Its chaebols, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, are household names synonymous with innovation. Beyond the economic might, Hallyu, the Korean wave, has become a cultural phenomenon, dissolving borders and connecting people through music, film, and television. Yet beneath this glittering surface, South Korea faces its own complex challenges. A rapidly aging population threatens its economic dynamism and social safety net. Fierce political polarization often paralyzes national discourse, and then there's the ever-present shadow of its northern neighbour, dictating defence spending, influencing foreign policy, and shaping the very identity of a nation still technically at war. The relationship with the US remains the bedrock of South Korean security. The presence of tens of thousands of American troops is a visible deterrent, a testament to an alliance forged in the fires of conflict. But this alliance isn't without its complexities. Debates over burden sharing, the strategic direction of the alliance, and even the efficacy of diplomatic approaches to North Korea frequently surface. South Korea finds itself in a delicate balancing act, maintaining a robust defense posture, pursuing diplomatic avenues when possible, and trying to manage the geopolitical competition between its primary ally, the US, and its powerful neighbour, China, which remains North Korea's most important economic and political patron. But let's not forget the profound human cost of this division. For over 7 decades, millions of families have been torn apart. Imagine this: parents who never saw their children grow up, siblings who never reunited, spouses who lived out their lives in different worlds, never knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. The occasional tightly controlled reunion meetings are poignant, heartbreaking spectacles, offering fleeting moments of connection before the wall of division descends once more. These are not just statistics. These are lives interrupted, futures shattered, and a collective trauma that runs deep through the Korean psyche. The cultural divergence, too, has become immense. While both Koreas share a common historical and linguistic heritage, 7 decades of radically different political systems, information environments, and external influences have created 2 distinct societies. Think about the language itself. While the core grammar and vocabulary are shared, North Korea has purged many foreign loanwords and developed its own unique lexicon, reflecting its isolation and ideological purity. South Korea, on the other hand, has embraced global influences, absorbing English terms and pop culture references. The way people think, interact, and perceive the world has diverged so profoundly that even if the border were to open tomorrow, the psychological and cultural gaps would be immense. This brings us to the ultimate question: reunification. Is it still a viable dream, or has it become a nostalgic aspiration for an increasingly distant past? For many older Koreans in the South, reunification remains a sacred goal, a moral imperative to heal the wounds of war. But for younger generations, who have grown up in a prosperous democratic South Korea with no memory of a unified nation, the idea of integrating with a drastically different, impoverished and totalitarian North Korea can seem daunting, even frightening. The economic costs alone would be astronomical, dwarfing even Germany's reunification experience. The social and political challenges of merging 2 societies with such disparate values, legal systems, and human rights records would be unprecedented. North Korea, of course, also champions reunification, but on its own terms, a unified Korea under the Kim dynasty's socialist system. This is a non-starter for the democratic South and its allies. The sporadic inter-Korean summits, like those in 2018, offered glimmers of hope, moments where leaders from both sides shook hands across the DMZ, promising a new era of peace. Yet these gestures, while symbolically powerful, ultimately failed to yield lasting breakthroughs on denuclearization or a permanent peace settlement. The fundamental disagreements remain, stark and seemingly intractable. So, where does that leave us? On a peninsula defined by a fragile armistice, a heavily fortified border, and the constant threat of miscalculation. The story of Korea in the 21st century is a testament to resilience and ingenuity in the South, and a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism and nuclear proliferation in the North. It's a living history unfolding before our eyes, where ancient traditions meet cutting-edge technology, and the ghosts of division haunt the present. The path forward is shrouded in uncertainty. Will diplomacy ever truly succeed in denuclearizing the North? Can a lasting peace be forged, or are the two Koreas destined to remain locked in this precarious stalemate? And what of the Korean people themselves, forever grappling with the identity of a nation divided against itself? These are not easy questions, and their answers will shape not just the future of the Korean Peninsula, but the geopolitical landscape of the entire world. The journey through Korea's history has shown us a people capable of extraordinary endurance and innovation, but the ultimate chapter on their division remains unwritten, a testament to the complex, often heartbreaking realities of power, ideology, and human possibility. We've traced the incredible, often heartbreaking journey of the Korean Peninsula from mythical antiquity to the crucible of the 20th century. We've seen how a single, resilient people forged a unique identity, endured brutal invasions, and birthed astonishing cultural achievements. But then, a fateful line on a map drawn by outsiders cleaved that identity in two, setting the stage for a conflict that never truly ended. Now, as we stand in the 21st century, the story of the two Koreas isn't just a historical footnote, it's a living, breathing geopolitical drama with global implications. Think about this for a second. Two nations, once one, now exist not just as separate states, but as ideological mirror images, each a stark counterpoint to the other. You have South Korea, a vibrant, hyper-connected democracy, a global leader in technology, culture, and economic might. And just miles away, across the most heavily fortified border on Earth, you have North Korea, an isolated, authoritarian, and opaque state, perpetually on the brink, defined by its nuclear ambitions and its absolute control over information. How can this profound divergence be reconciled? What does the future hold for a peninsula still technically at war? The most immediate and pressing concern, the one that keeps policymakers and citizens alike on edge, is North Korea's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons. For Pyongyang, this isn't just about military might. It's an existential guarantee. From their perspective, observing the fates of nations like Iraq and Libya, regimes that gave up their WMD programs only to face intervention, the nuclear arsenal is the ultimate deterrent, the shield against perceived external threats, particularly from the United States. Under Kim Jong-un, this program has accelerated at an alarming pace. We've witnessed multiple nuclear tests, including claimed hydrogen bombs, and a dizzying array of ballistic missile launches, short-range, intermediate range, and critically intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, theoretically capable of reaching the US mainland. Each test is a defiant challenge to international norms, a flexing of military muscle, and a clear message. North Korea will not relinquish its weapons. This nuclear pivot has fundamentally reshaped the strategic landscape. For South Korea, it means living under the constant shadow of a nuclear-armed neighbor, a reality that dictates much of its defense policy and its unwavering alliance with the United States. For the global community, it represents a significant proliferation risk, a challenge to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and a constant source of regional instability. The international response has been a complex dance of sanctions, diplomacy, and deterrence. Sanctions, aimed at crippling North Korea's economy and forcing it to the negotiating table, have been extensive, targeting everything from its coal exports to its financial transactions. Yet the regime, remarkably resilient and adept at evading these measures, continues its development, often at immense cost to its own populace. Diplomacy, too, has seen its ebbs and flows, from the quote 41 of the early 2000s to the high-stakes summits between Kim Jong-un and various world leaders, including a sitting US president. These moments offered tantalizing glimpses of a potential breakthrough, a pathway to denuclearization, but time and again they have faltered, leaving us back at square one, with North Korea's nuclear capabilities only growing stronger. Meanwhile, South Korea, facing this direct threat, has continued its astonishing ascent on the global stage. The miracle on the Han River was just the beginning. Today you have a nation that is not just economically prosperous, but also a cultural juggernaut. The Korean wave, or Hallyu, has swept across the globe, captivating audiences with K-pop, K-dramas and cinema that consistently pushes artistic boundaries. Think about BTS selling out stadiums worldwide, or Parasite winning the Academy Award for Best Picture. These aren't just cultural exports, they're powerful statements of soft power, showcasing a dynamic, innovative, and deeply creative society. This cultural vibrancy is intrinsically linked to its technological prowess. From Samsung to LG, South Korean companies are household names, driving innovation in everything from smartphones to semiconductors, shaping how we connect and interact in our daily lives. This is a nation that has not only rebuilt from the ashes of war, but has transformed itself into a global trendsetter, a testament to its ingenuity and relentless drive. Yet even with all its success, South Korea grapples with its own set of complex challenges. Its democracy, hard won through decades of struggle, continues to evolve, facing issues of political polarization, economic inequality, and rapid demographic shifts. The pressure of its fiercely competitive society, while fueling its success, also leads to high stress levels and social anxieties. And always, there is the shadow of the North, influencing everything from defense spending to its foreign policy, forcing a delicate balance between engagement and deterrence. South Korea's leaders must navigate their crucial alliance with the United States, while also managing a complex, often fraught relationship with China, North Korea's primary economic and political patron. It's a geopolitical tightrope walk, where every step has profound implications for regional stability. But beyond the high-stakes geopolitics and the grand narratives of economic miracles and nuclear threats, lies the profoundly human cost of this division. We talk about the DMZ as a geographical boundary, a demilitarized zone, but it's also a scar, a wound that runs through the heart of millions of families. Think about the separated families, elderly Koreans who might have seen their siblings, parents, or children for the last time over 70 years ago. The brief, emotional reunions, often orchestrated after decades of longing, are a poignant reminder of what has been lost. These aren't just numbers, these are lives, shattered by a political division they had no hand in creating. The hope for reunification, for many of these individuals, is not an abstract political goal, but a deeply personal, visceral yearning to mend broken bonds before it's too late. The DMZ, a landscape of fences, landmines and guard posts, has also, paradoxically, become an unintentional wildlife refuge, a testament to nature's resilience in the face of human conflict. but for those who remember a time before the division, it stands as a stark monument to a dream deferred. The question of reunification itself is perhaps the greatest unresolved mystery of all. Is it even possible? And if so, on what terms? The ideological chasm is immense. South Korea, a capitalist democracy, values individual liberty, free markets, and global integration. North Korea, a socialist juche state, prioritizes collective loyalty, self-reliance, and absolute devotion to the Kim dynasty. The economic disparity is staggering. Integrating the two economies would be an undertaking of unprecedented scale, akin to Germany's reunification, but arguably far more challenging given the decades of complete isolation and divergent development. The social and cultural differences, too, have grown profound. Decades of information control in the north and hyperconnectivity in the south have created two distinct societies, speaking the same language but living in entirely different mental universes. The political hurdles are equally daunting. Who would lead a unified Korea? What political system would prevail? How would the international community react to such a seismic shift in the regional balance of power? There have been moments, brief glimmers of hope, where inter-Korean dialogue seemed to offer a path forward. The quote, 44 of the late 1990s and early 2000s, pursued by South Korean presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, aimed to foster reconciliation through engagement and aid, leading to historic summits and limited economic projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex. More recently, in 2018, we saw another series of high-profile summits with leaders from both Koreas and even the US meeting at the DMZ itself. These moments sparked renewed optimism, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, a thawing was possible. Yet each time, North Korea's unwavering commitment to its nuclear program, coupled with its deep-seated suspicion of the outside world, ultimately stalled progress, leaving the peninsula in a familiar state of tension and stalemate. So, where does this leave us? The Korean Peninsula remains a geopolitical flashpoint, a delicate balance of power and deterrence, where a fragile armistice holds the peace. North Korea's nuclear arsenal is, for the regime, non-negotiable, a survival mechanism that dictates its every move. South Korea, a global powerhouse, navigates this complex reality with a blend of strategic alliances, economic prowess, and cultural soft power. Millions of families remain separated, a poignant human cost that transcends political rhetoric. The cultural and ideological divergence is immense, making reunification a daunting and complex challenge, fraught with immense economic, social, and political hurdles. The ultimate chapter on the Korean Peninsula's division and the possibility of a unified future remains unwritten. Will the two Koreas ever bridge the chasm that divides them? Will the human cost of separation ever truly be addressed? Or will this painful division persist, a stark reminder of the Cold War's enduring legacy? These are not just questions for historians, they are questions for the present, shaping the lives of millions and influencing the trajectory of global politics. The story of Korea, a tale of resilience, division, and an uncertain future, continues to unfold before our eyes.